The morning I bought the 12 lame heifers was a Tuesday in late October of 1987. I remember the air had that particular damp chill that promises a hard frost is no more than a week off, the kind of cold that feels like it's rising from the ground itself instead of coming down from the sky. The sky was the color of old tin, flat and gray and holding its breath. The sale barn was mostly empty by the time I backed my old stock trailer up to the loading chute. The auctioneer, a man I'd known for 30 years, just shook his head when he saw me. He'd already run the last of the decent stock through, and all that was left was what he called the cleanup pen. 12 head of mixed breed heifers, none of them more than 500 pounds, and every single one of them with something wrong. A few had the beginnings of foot rot, limping gingerly on swollen ankles. One had a hitch in her hip that made her swing her whole back end out with every step. Another had a cloudy eye. They were the kind of animals that cost more in time and worry than they could ever bring on the rail. They'd been passed over 3 times, the price dropping with each pass, until the auctioneer was basically begging someone to take them off the owner's hands and save him the trouble of calling the rendering truck. I got all 12 for $110. Not $110 a head, $110 for the lot. Less than $10 apiece. The paperwork took longer than the bidding. As I was coaxing the last one up the ramp, a big black heifer with a noticeable limp in her front left, a new truck pulled up alongside my rig. It was a King Ranch F250, the color of burnt caramel, and it didn't have a speck of dust on it, which tells you a lot about a man's relationship with his ground. Carl Peterson leaned out the window, his arm resting on the clean sill. He was a good 10 years younger than me, had inherited his father's prime bottomland and farmed it with a line of credit and a deep belief in the wisdom of the University Extension Office. He meant well, I suppose. "Morning," he said, his voice polite, clearing out the bargain pen. I nodded, not breaking my rhythm as I slid the heavy gate shut. "Something like that." He watched the heifers huddle together in the front of my trailer, a miserable-looking bunch. "What are you doing with a dozen charity cases, old man?" he asked. The question was honest, not cruel, but it was weighted with the certainty of a man who deals in pounds and percentages. To him, this was the transaction, and by any modern measure, it was a bad one. I looked at the heifers, then back at him. "I'm going to put them on the North 20, I said. Carl's eyebrows went up. The North 20 was the piece of ground that bordered his property, a patch of land my grandfather had given up on 60 years ago. It was 20 acres of overgrown buckthorn, wild grapevines that could swallow a tractor, and more poison ivy than a man had any right to own. The soil was thin, the grade was steep, and it was choked with fieldstone. It was land you fenced off and forgot about. "On the bramble?" he said, using my grandfather's old name for it. "There's nothing up there for them but thorns and trouble. You'll lose them in that brush." I just gave the latch on the trailer gate a final check. I told him I was farming. I said more to myself than to him. It was what I always said when someone questioned a decision that didn't fit their spreadsheets. He shook his head slowly, a little smile on his face, the kind of smile a man gives you when he's certain you're a fool but is too polite to say it to your face. He put his truck in gear. "Well, don't come calling me when you need help pulling them out of a ditch." He drove off, leaving behind the faint smell of new leather and exhaust. I stood there for a minute in the quiet of the sale yard, the gray light pressing down. I looked through the slats of the trailer at those 12 animals. They weren't just lame, they were attentive. An animal that has to favor a foot, that has to think about every step, sees the world differently. It pays attention to the ground in a way a sound animal never has to. My grandfather used to say that. "A hurt foot makes for a wise head," he'd tell me. I didn't know yet what those heifers knew, and I didn't know yet what they were looking for or what they were about to find. I just knew that for less than the price of a new tire for Carl's truck, I had bought myself a dozen experts in the science of finding solid ground. And I had a piece of land that had been waiting for that kind of attention for a very long time. By noon the next day, the diner in town had a version of the story, and, as stories do in small towns, the version had grown. In that telling, I hadn't just bought 12 lame heifers. I had outbid a rendering plan for the privilege, and I was planning to start a retirement home for crippled livestock. The story wasn't mean-spirited, not really. It was just another chapter in the town's long-running, affectionate chronicle of my family's stubbornness. We'd always been the ones to fix an old tractor instead of buying a new one, to trust a seed line that had been in the family for generations over the latest hybrid in the glossy catalog. This was just more of the same. My wife, Martha, heard it when she went in for coffee. She came home and just looked at me as I was mixing a mash for the new arrivals. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there with her arms crossed. Then she asked the one practical question. How many acres are we talking about? The North 20, I said, not looking up from the bucket. The bramble. She was quiet for another beat. And the fence? The fence on the North 20 hadn't been walked in my lifetime. It was a ruin of rusted wire and fallen posts. I'll run a hot wire, I said. Just a single strand, enough to keep them contained. She nodded slowly. She trusted me, but she was grounded in the reality of our balance sheet. She wasn't impressed by sentiment. Her trust was a practical thing, an investment, and she expected a return, even if that return was just peace of mind. Well, she said finally, they're cheaper than a brush hog. And that was the end of it. The next person to weigh in was the vet. He was out a few days later to look at one of my older cows, and he saw the heifers in the holding pen near the barn. He walked over, a professional curiosity in his eyes. He leaned on the gate, watching them move. He was a good man, fresh out of the state university, and he saw the world through a lens of modern animal science. He saw pathogens and protein deficiencies and poor rates of gain. He saw problems to be solved with injections and feed additives. Saw your new herd, he said, pulling off a glove. Got your work cut out for you. I told him about the foot rot and what I was doing for it. He nodded, agreeing with the treatment. You can get them sound, he allowed. But the cost-benefit on these, it's just not there. They'll spend more on penicillin and feed than they'll ever be worth in meat. You'd have been better off just leaving them at the sale. He wasn't wrong, by his math. He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket, the kind with charts and tables printed inside the cover. You know what it would cost to clear that North 20 with a dozer and a mulcher? I ran the numbers for a client last year. You're looking at close to $400 an acre. Maybe more with the rock you've got up there. $8,000 to make that ground even usable. And for what? Thin topsoil over clay. It'll never be prime pasture. He meant to be helpful. He was offering me data, a column of figures designed to end the conversation, to save me from my own foolishness. He was showing me the sensible path. I just nodded. I appreciate you running the numbers, I said. He shook his head, tucked his notebook away, and went back to his truck. From his world, I was a sentimental old man making a decision based on emotion, not economics. He couldn't see the other ledger I was working from, the one that had been kept for 100 years on this place. My real reason for bringing those animals home wasn't sentiment. It was a half-remembered lesson from my grandfather. I must have been 8 or 9 years old. We were moving a flock of ewes, and one of them had a stone bruise. A bad one. She was hobbling, holding her right foreleg off the ground. I asked my grandfather if we should leave her in the barn. He shook his head. No, he said, his voice quiet and sure. She's the most important one in the flock today. He explained it to me then, in that simple way he had. An animal with a hurt foot pays more attention to where it's walking. He said, the healthy ones, they just follow the one in front. They put their feet down without thinking. But her, she's testing the ground with every step. She's looking for the smoothest path, the driest spot, the firmest footing. Lame animals are the best surveyors. They'll find the old paths the land remembers, the ones that were there before our fences. He believed that the land had a memory, a structure that animals could read. He believed that a weakness in an animal could become a strength, a tool for seeing what the strong and careless overlooked. That day, he put the flock on our rockiest pasture, and he told me to watch the lame ewe. And he was right. She didn't go with the flock. She picked her way along a different line, a gentle contour I'd never noticed, and the rest of the flock eventually followed her lead. He looked at me and smiled. They pay attention, he said. That's the whole secret. They just pay attention. That night, after Martha was asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather's words. The memory was so clear, it felt less like a memory and more like an instruction. I put on my boots and a jacket and walked out to the main barn. The air was cold and still. A single bare bulb threw a weak yellow circle of light onto the dusty concrete floor. Over in the corner, tucked behind a stack of old seed bags, was the steel milk can. It was heavy, made of galvanized steel, with a tight-fitting lid. My grandfather had used it to store his records, not because he was hiding them, but because he believed in keeping important things safe from mice and moisture. He used to say, "The two things that will ruin a farmer are a bad memory and a wet ledger." I hadn't opened that can in 20 years. The lid was stiff and it made a loud scraping sound when I finally worked it loose. The air that came out smelled of old paper and dry dust and time. Inside, everything was just as I remembered. There were stacks of small, leather-bound pocket diaries, a few old seed catalogs from the 1950s, and, at the very bottom, his main ledger. It was a standard composition book, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, its corners softened and worn from years of use. His name was written on the label on the front in his careful, blocky script. Samuel Turner, Farm Records, 1948. I carried it over to the workbench and sat down on an overturned bucket under the light. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with his handwriting, a steady, deliberate cursive that had faded from black to a soft brown. He wasn't a man for prose. His entries were terse, factual. April 12th, 1948. Rain all morning, 1.2 inches in the gauge. Planted corn in the south field, soil temp 54 degrees. May 3rd, 1948. First calf of the season. Bull calf from the Hereford Cross, 78 pounds, healthy. I spent an hour just turning the pages, reading his account of a year on this farm, a year that happened before I was even born. It felt like a conversation across time. I was looking at the same fields he had, worrying about the same rains, celebrating the same new life. The farm was the constant, the thing that connected us. I was just another steward passing through. I knew what I was looking for. Towards the back of the book, he had a section where he made notes on each pasture, its quirks, its problems, its potential. I found the page for the North 20. At the top, he had written in big letters, "The Bramble." His notes were brief. Thin soil, too much stone to plow, good for nothing but goats, fences poor. It was a dismissal, a piece of ground written off as a bad investment of time and energy. It confirmed everything Carl and the vet believed. I almost closed the book right there. I felt a little foolish, sitting in a cold barn in the middle of the night, chasing a ghost story from my childhood. I was ready to admit they were right. It was a bad piece of land, and I'd made a sentimental purchase. But then my light caught something at the very bottom of the page. It was a single line, added later it looked like. The ink was a little darker, the handwriting a little more rushed. It was set apart from the other notes, almost an afterthought. He had written, "Old foundations somewhere near the big oak. Stone feels different underfoot in dry summer. Never dug." And then, right next to it, he had underlined the words "never dug" twice. Underneath that, a single penciled question mark. Never dug. The words hung there in the quiet of the barn. It wasn't a statement of fact, it was an invitation. A loose thread he had noticed but never pulled. A question he had asked of the land but never stayed for the answer. The stone feels different. It was exactly what he had taught me to look for, the subtle change in the ground that a lame animal would notice first. My grandfather wasn't just recording data, he was leaving a map for someone who knew how to read it, for someone who was paying attention. I sat there for a long time, just looking at that one line. The big oak he mentioned was still there, a massive bur oak that stood on the highest point of the North 20, its gnarled branches a landmark against the sky. I'd seen it my whole life. I had never once thought to wonder what might be underneath it. I closed the notebook gently, the old paper whispering, I put it back in the milk can and sealed the lid. I wasn't ready to tell anyone about it, not even Martha. This was a quiet thing, a conversation between me, my grandfather, and a piece of forgotten ground. The 12 heifers in the pen were no longer just a dozen charity cases. They were my surveyors. They were the key. And the next morning, I would give them their assignment. The next morning, I was out before 5 o'clock. The air was sharp in my lungs, and the ground was stiff with the first real frost of the year. I loaded a roll of electric fence wire, a battery fencer, and a bag of step-in posts into the bed of the truck. It took me the better part of 3 hours to run a single hot wire around the perimeter of the North 20. The work was slow and difficult. I had to fight my way through thickets of buckthorn that tore at my jacket and tangled the wire. Wild grapevines, as thick as my wrist, snaked between the trees, and I had to use an axe to clear a path in places. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks that turned my ankle and stumps hidden under layers of dead leaves. I understood why my grandfather had called it the Bramble. It was a forgotten place, a part of the farm that had been allowed to go back to its wild state. It felt older than the rest of the farm, less tamed. By the time I finished, the sun was up, a pale disk in the white sky. I walked the line one last time, checking the connections, making sure the wire was clear of any branches that might ground it out. Then I drove back to the barn. The heifers were waiting, huddled together against the morning chill. I let them out of the holding pen and began the slow process of herding them up the lane toward the gate of the North 20. They moved slowly, carefully. The one with the bad hip lagged behind, and the others waited for her. They were a herd, a single unit moving with a shared, cautious intelligence. When I opened the gate, they didn't bolt into the new pasture. They paused, heads up, nostrils testing the air. They looked into the dense brush, and for a moment, I thought they might refuse to go in. Then one of them, a small red heifer with a limp in her front right, took a tentative step forward. Then another. She didn't charge into the thicket. She moved along the edge, where the undergrowth was less dense, picking her way through the rocks. The others followed her lead, falling into a single file line behind her. They moved like water finding the path of least resistance, a slow, deliberate procession into the wildness of the pasture. I closed the gate behind them and just stood there and watched. For the first few days, I was out there constantly, checking on them. I was worried they'd get tangled in the vines or that the coyotes would take advantage of their weakness, but they were smarter than I gave them credit for. They didn't scatter. They stayed together, always within sight of each other. They moved as a group, a slow-moving island of calm in that chaotic landscape. They didn't try to fight the buckthorn. They were not browsers like goats. They were grazers. They ignored the woody, thorny brush and instead focused on the patches of grass and clover they found in the small clearings. They began to work the edges of the thickets, clearing the ground-level vegetation, pushing the boundary of the brush back a few inches each day. They were patient, they were methodical, and they were paying attention. They moved with a slowness that allowed them to see the world in detail. They knew where the ground was soft and marshy after a rain, and they avoided those spots. They found the game trails, the paths worn by deer and raccoons, and used them to navigate the densest sections. I spent hours just sitting on a fallen log, watching them. It was better than any television program. I started to see the pasture through their eyes. I saw the way the land folded and dipped, the subtle changes in vegetation that signaled a change in the soil beneath. I learned their habits. They spent their mornings in the lower, more sheltered part of the pasture. In the afternoons, as the sun warmed the southern slope, they would slowly make their way uphill. And every evening, without fail, they congregated in the same spot. It was a slight rise near the center of the pasture, a place I had never paid much mind to before. It was dominated by the one landmark my grandfather had mentioned in his notebook, the Big Bur Oak. The tree was ancient, probably 300 years old. Its trunk was as wide as my truck, and its gnarled branches spread out like the arms of an old god, creating a wide circle of open ground beneath it. The heifers would gather there as the light began to fade. They would lie down in the thin grass, chewing their cud, always facing out, a circle of quiet sentinels. They had claimed that spot as their own. It was their sanctuary, their high ground. and they were keeping it grazed down tight, almost like a lawn. Week after week, this pattern held. While the rest of the pasture was a chaotic tangle, the ground under the big oak was becoming clearer, more defined. The heifers were focusing their attention there, and I knew it was time for me to focus mine there as well. I waited another 2 weeks. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to let the animals do their work without my interference. My grandfather believed in letting the land and the livestock show you the way, and not rushing in with a man's impatience. He used to say, the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. I was trying to pay attention. Every day, the circle of cleared ground under the oak tree grew a little wider, a little more defined. The heifers, their feet slowly healing in the dry solid footing of that high ground, had manicured it. They had eaten the weeds, trampled the small brush, and exposed the soil. From a distance, it looked like a perfect green carpet spread out beneath the ancient tree. On a cold morning in mid-November, I decided it was time. I took my soil probe and walked up to the north 20. The heifers watched me, their chewing slowing as I approached, but they didn't move. They seemed to accept my presence there in their chosen spot. The soil probe is a simple tool. It's a T-handle welded to a 3-foot steel rod, sharpened to a point. It doesn't give you a lab analysis, but it tells you a story. It tells you about compaction, about moisture, about the texture of the soil, and it tells you when you hit something that isn't dirt. I started at the edge of the cleared circle. I pushed the probe into the ground. It slid in easily for the first 12, maybe 14 inches. Dark, rich topsoil, full of organic matter from centuries of leaf fall from the oak. Then it got firmer, transitioning into the familiar heavy clay that made up most of this hillside. The probe went down another 6 inches and then stopped. I put my weight on it, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled it out. The tip was scratched. I had hit fieldstone, the same round, glacier-tumbled rock that littered the rest of the pasture. This was what I expected. I moved in 5 feet, closer to the trunk of the tree, and tried again. The same result. Topsoil, then clay, then the hard, unyielding stop of a rock at about 18 inches. I was beginning to feel that same sense of foolishness I'd felt in the barn. Maybe my grandfather had been mistaken. Maybe the heifers just liked the view. I walked another 10 feet in, to a spot almost directly under the widest branch of the oak. I set the point of the probe on the ground and leaned into it. It sank through the topsoil, smooth as butter. It entered the clay layer. I pushed deeper. 18 inches, 20, 24. I was expecting the jolt of hitting rock, but it never came. Instead, at about 30 inches, the probe stopped. But it wasn't the sharp, jarring stop of hitting a rounded fieldstone. It was a dull, solid thump. It was a flat sound, a sound that resonated up the steel rod into my hands. It felt different. The stone feels different. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. I pulled the probe out and looked at the tip. There was a fine, pale powder on it, almost like limestone dust. I moved over 3 feet to the right and tried again. Same thing. 30 inches down, the same flat, solid thump. I felt a current of excitement, the kind a man feels when a long-held suspicion starts to solidify into fact. I spent the next 2 hours working in a grid pattern. I pushed that probe into the ground every 3 feet, marking each spot with a small twig. A pattern began to emerge, a rectangle, a very distinct rectangle, roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. Inside that rectangle, the probe consistently hit a flat, solid surface at 30 inches. Outside that rectangle, I hit the random, unpredictable depths of natural fieldstone. The heifers had found it. They hadn't been choosing the spot for the view or for the shade. They had been choosing it for the drainage. The ground over this buried structure was different. The fill dirt was less compacted, and whatever was beneath it was preventing the water from pooling, creating a consistently dry, stable place for them to rest their sore feet. They hadn't been looking for a foundation. They had been looking for comfort, and in their search for comfort, they had outlined a mystery as clearly as if they had drawn it on a map. I stood there in the quiet of the afternoon, the twig grid laid out at my feet. The 12 heifers were resting nearby, their work done. They had paid attention, and now, finally, So had I. I thought about Carl's clean truck and the vet's well-meaning spreadsheets. They saw a worthless piece of land and a dozen animals that were a net loss. They had all the data, all the modern certainty, but they had never stood on this ground and listened. They had never trusted the wisdom of a lame animal. My grandfather's note wasn't just an observation, it was a trust. He was trusting that someone, someday, would come along who knew how to ask the right questions, and who knew that sometimes the best surveyors have 4 legs and a limp. I knew I couldn't go any further on my own. Shovels and a strong back could tell me more, but I needed an expert eye. Someone who could read stone the way I could read soil or the sky. There was only one person to call. His name was Silas Croft, and he was in his late 70s, maybe even 80. He'd spent his whole life working with stone, mostly fixing the old fieldstone foundations on the century-old barns and houses that dotted our county. He was a man of few words, and he had a reputation for being honest to the point of bluntness. He didn't advertise. You just knew who to call when you had a problem with old stone. I found his number in the phone book and called him from the kitchen. I didn't tell him what I thought I'd found. I've learned that if you tell an expert what you expect him to see, that's often all he'll look for. I just told him I had a foundation issue on some old ground and asked if he'd come take a look. He said he'd be out the next afternoon. He arrived in a battered Ford Ranger, the kind of truck that has earned every one of its dents. He was a small, wiry man with hands that looked like they were carved from granite. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He just nodded at me and asked, "Where is it?" I led him up the lane to the north 20. The Heifers watched us approach their sanctuary under the oak, their jaws slowly moving. Silas stopped for a moment and looked at them, then at the neatly gray circle of ground. He didn't say anything, but I saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. I showed him the grid of twigs I had laid out. "I keep hitting something flat," I said, "about 30 inches down, inside this rectangle." He grunted, a non-committal sound. He went back to his truck and came back with a long iron bar, about 5 feet long, with a pointed tip and a heavy, mushroomed head from years of being struck with a sledgehammer. He called it his persuader. He walked to the center of the rectangle and drove the bar into the ground with a few sharp thrusts. It sank easily, then stopped with the same dull thump I had felt through my soil probe. He pulled it out and examined the tip. He did it again, a few feet away. Same result. He went silent. It was the kind of silence that means a man is thinking hard, processing information that doesn't fit his expectations. He walked the perimeter of the rectangle I had marked, his eyes on the ground, reading the subtle contours of the land. Then he knelt down, pulling a small trowel from his back pocket. He scraped away a section of sod and loose topsoil, digging down a few inches with his gnarled hands. He pulled up a piece of loose stone, about the size of a loaf of bread. He turned it over and over, brushing the dirt from its surfaces. His silence deepened. He ran his thumb along one of the edges. Then he looked at me. "This isn't fieldstone," he said. His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. "Fieldstone is round. The glacier tumbles it smooth. This," he held it up for me to see. The edges were straight. The face was roughly flat. It had been worked. "This is dressed stone. Someone quarried this and shaped it with a hammer and chisel." He stood up, still holding the stone. He looked at the ancient oak, then at the rectangle I had marked down. "This wasn't a barn," he said. "A man doesn't use dressed limestone for a barn foundation on a farm like this. Too much work. You use the stone you pull from the fields. No, this was a house, a cellar, most likely, and whoever built it was proud of his work." He paused, looking down at the ground as if he could see through it. "Substantial," he said, the word carrying a weight of professional respect. "And they covered it proper when they left, filled it in neat and tidy." We had our answer. The Heifers had found the cellar of the original homestead, the one that must have been here before my family bought the land, the one that had been erased from all the maps and all the living memories. We stood there for a long moment, the man who reads stone and the man who reads soil, both of us humbled by the quiet intelligence of the animals resting nearby. The vindication was a quiet, private thing. It wasn't about being right. It was about seeing something true and hidden, finally brought into the light. Silas looked at me. "You got a couple of good shovels?" he asked. An hour later, we were standing in a small, freshly dug pit at one corner of the rectangle. Less than 2 feet down, the blades of our shovels had scraped against something hard. We cleared the dirt away carefully, and there it was. The top course of a dry stack limestone wall. The stones were fitted together so perfectly, without a lick of mortar, that you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. The workmanship was breathtaking. Each stone had been chosen and shaped to fit its neighbors, a three-dimensional puzzle assembled by a master craftsman a century and a half ago. We spent the rest of the afternoon clearing a 10-foot section of the wall. It went down, course after perfect course, into the dark, cool earth. Near the end of the day, we uncovered the top of a massive, single-piece stone lintel, the kind that would span a doorway or an entrance. The Heifers had been right. The ground was different here because it was a roof, an earthen roof over a hollow space. They had found the driest, most stable, most comfortable piece of real estate on the whole 20 acres. They hadn't cared that it was a piece of history. They only cared that it was home. A month passed, the autumn rains came and went, and the air grew colder, holding the sharp promise of snow. Silas and I had spent a few more weekends working at the site. We had fully exposed the entrance, a set of stone steps leading down into the darkness. The cellar was intact. The roof, made of massive stone slabs covered with 30 inches of earth, was still sound. It was a perfectly preserved piece of the past, a time capsule of forgotten craftsmanship. The Heifers were fat and healthy. Their limps were gone, their coats were thick and glossy. The quiet, comfortable ground and the lack of competition for forage had worked a slow miracle on them. They were no longer a collection of charity cases. They were a fine-looking herd. One Saturday afternoon, I saw a familiar truck slow down on the road that ran along the edge of the North 20. It was Carl Peterson's immaculate King Ranch F250. He pulled over onto the shoulder, the engine idling. I expected him to just sit there and look for a minute before driving on, the way he usually did. But this time, the driver's side door opened. He got out. This was unusual. Carl rarely set foot on my property. He walked over to the fence, his boots clean enough to wear in his living room. He looked past me, his eyes fixed on the excavation under the oak tree. He could see the exposed stone walls, the dark rectangle of the entrance leading down into the earth. He took in the sight for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze shifted to the 12 heifers grazing peacefully on the rise. They were a different set of animals from the ones he'd seen me load at the sale barn. They were calm, filled out, and sound on their feet. He looked from the animals to the cellar, and I could see the pieces clicking into place in his mind. He was a smart man, a good farmer. He understood what he was looking at. He understood the connection. He turned to me, and for the first time, the polite certainty was gone from his face. It was replaced by something that looked a lot like respect. He just nodded, a single small movement of his head. "That's not as wet as it was," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the pasture. It was his way of acknowledging the whole thing, the drainage, the cellar, the wisdom of the animals. Then he added, "You might not be as wrong as I thought." That was all. He didn't ask what it was or how I found it. He didn't need to. He got back in his truck, the door closing with a solid and expensive thud, and drove away. It was the quietest, most understated concession I had ever received, and in its own way, it was the most satisfying. It wasn't a victory. I hadn't been trying to beat him or prove him wrong. I had just been trying to listen to the land, to follow a thread my grandfather had left for me. But to have the world of spreadsheets and modern efficiency acknowledge, even for a moment, the value of the old way, that was enough. Later that evening, I took my grandfather's ledger out again. I sat at the kitchen table and opened it to the page for the bramble. Underneath his final entry, "Never dug," I took out my own pen. I thought for a long time about what to write. I could have written about the cellar, its dimensions, the quality of the stonework. I could have recorded the date of the discovery, but that all felt like data. The kind of thing the vet would put in his notebook. It didn't capture the heart of it. Instead, I wrote just 2 words. They knew. My grandfather always told me that you can't farm what you've already spent. He was talking about money, about not getting ahead of yourself with debt and expensive equipment. But I think he meant something more. He meant you can't farm with a closed mind, with a set of assumptions you've already paid for. You have to be open to what the land and the animals are trying to tell you, right now, today. Those 12 heifers, with their herd feet and their cautious steps, they weren't a liability. They were a lesson. They taught me to pay attention, to trust the quiet, slow, and overlooked. They were looking for comfort, for solid ground, and in doing so, they uncovered a piece of this farm soul that had been buried for 100 years. They reminded me that the most valuable things are often not the ones that make the most noise, but the ones that have been patiently waiting for someone to listen. If you've got your own piece of overlooked ground, your own bramble that everyone else has written off, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Or maybe you have a stubborn animal that taught you something the experts missed. Let me know. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There's a lot of wisdom buried just under the surface if we're only willing to look.